Welcome to the J.D. Levy and Associates Calibration Point Podcast. Our podcasts are designed to bring a conversational exploration of key topics that we believe will provide value and insight to those serving in the nonprofit sector. We will highlight new developments in the field, latest research, and things we're learning from our own clients that we can share.
I want to welcome everybody to this month's episode of the Calibration Point Podcast. I'm just super excited to have Bob Jones back with us again, just getting to continue to explore just the wealth of experience that you have, expertise, everything, Bob. And as we've said, you've gone from being a high-level corporate CEO to now being a high-level civic engaged volunteer and getting to put your fingers in a lot of stuff, but now in retirement. And this was, as we kind of teased in our last episodes, Bob, a chance to bring you on and just talk about how you've managed the identity change going from, you jokingly mentioned sitting in the front of the room to now, maybe having a seat, maybe sitting in the back of the room as you've gone into retirement. And just, this is an issue we experience a lot when I do leadership transition work. And that's especially for those leaders that are coming from, an organization that they've had a significant footprint in or fingerprint in and or founders, and then they're going into retirement. And the identity change, the relationship change, just, so many of the shiftings that happen that you've been through. And just thought it'd be great to have you on just to talk with us about that experience. So I'm going to turn that over to you and we'll just explore.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. It's always good to be with you. And again, thanks for all you do. Let me just start by, as I went through retirement and people would ask me how it was going, and I began to describe it like I got divorced and I lost custody of the kids. Because your life is so much connected to what you are doing in your role. And then all of a sudden on May 10th, when I walked out the door, as somebody once told me, nobody returns your phone calls. They don't laugh at your jokes anymore. And you're not the guy. So, it's kind of like, and the hardest part is those relationships that you've built over time. But I would spin that just a little different, Jamie, and say it's really necessary to realize, again, I hate to use the word divorce, but you're leaving the organization. You've got to let your successor do their job. We've all seen too many cases when either founders or people that have had a long legacy have a hard time giving it up, and they either want an office there, they're going to show up to every board meeting.
Right. And
that's really difficult for the successor. And, kind of the agreement I had with Jim Ryan when I left was, if you need me, call me. You know where I'm at, but it's your job to run, and I'm going to do that. So there's emotion there. And then, so fast forward, you go through this process. And you wake up one day and say, what am I going to do? And, I've just said to anybody that I've had a conversation with, as you think about retirement, make sure you have purpose. And purpose is not going to the grocery store with your wife. It's not having your wife fix you lunch. It's not sitting around watching Dr. Phil and eating Cheetos. You've got to find some passion that you can do. And as you know better than anybody, you've got to be able to pay it forward. And, I think that makes for a good transition emotionally. And then to the beginning part of what I said, it's really good to get that transition for the organization that you left.
Yeah, really good points, especially about the purpose. So I guess a question then thinking about, I always tell when I do succession planning work, I always tell, especially those going into retirement, that you're going to get hit by these emotional waves. You just can't react to them or respond to them. You just got to let them flow over you, breathe with it, and then figure out what's truth in that emotion, and then move forward to whatever the next step is. And, it is, you just identified so many things that we hear about and work with people on that, it's the change of relationships, the change of reputation, recognition, the change of, the point that they are leading, and that they had a direct influence over things that they were passionate about. For you, what's interesting to me is because you were CEO of a large organization in multiple different communities and states. And so you had a lot of pockets of constituencies, not just in one city, but in a broad geographic scale. How has that impacted you as you went into retirement and just that sense of grieving? And I bring this up, Bob, because you get this for one. But when I actually build grieving into our succession planning work with leaders, and I often get kickback when people say, grieving. Why are we paying so much attention to grieving? And then we get in the process and they're like, oh my gosh, like I totally didn't understand the impact of grieving on the people who I was leaving, but then also myself. You had to grieve in multiple states and communities.
Yeah. And, again, Jimmy, it's a terrible analogy, but that's why I use the word divorce, because
Right.
you are grieving. You're grieving from lost relationships from your former employer. You're grieving about those, what I'd call accoutrements of life. When I would go to a market, when I was the CEO, there's all the trappings that came with that. Now I'm going there and everybody's like, oh, who's that again? I don't remember him. But let me twist that just a little bit and go back to the word purpose. So a lot of those relationships that I had established because of my work at my employer, I was able to leverage into this whole thing with purpose. So whether it was a fundraising or helping a nonprofit that's based in Indianapolis or South Bend or Madison, Wisconsin, having those relationships and maintaining some communication at a different level, but having that ability to do that, again, goes back to that purpose that you can maintain in a different level, those relationships, which I think are very important. But at the crux of all that is just what, again, I go back to purpose. What do you want your legacy to be as you make in this next transition in your life versus just being the old retired guy? I still joke I'm just an old retired guy, but I've been blessed to be able to try to help certain nonprofits or projects. And again, one of the other rules I had, it's maybe back to our divorce settlement from the bank, was I pledged to Jim Ryan when I left I would never ever ask him for anything. I wouldn't ask him to donate money. I wouldn't ask him for anything because it puts him in an awkward position.
Right.
How's he going to tell me no, right? And so I never wanted to put him in that position as well.
Interesting. So how can you pinpoint, if you had to say to someone that you're coaching and transitioning, hey, here are the one or two biggest either emotional impacts or things that are going to hit you whether you think they are or not? Like, were there a couple things as you were in the process of changing identity or transitioning identity,
Yep.
Or role? Are there a couple things that surprised you or hit you that maybe you weren't anticipating?
Yeah, I think the loss of the relationships with the people you work with. You think these are all your best friends,
Right.
and all of a sudden on May 10th, they've moved on. For me, that was my retirement day, but
Right.
I underestimated that emotional impact. And that 724, these are people I associated with, and I had to go out and rebuild a network of friends and acquaintances. I had what I would call acquaintances. Then there's the reality: are they my acquaintance because of where I worked? Are they my acquaintance because they actually like me? So that was hard, and it's a little. It wasn't as hard, but not hard. Is sitting on the sidelines and watching the success of your company that you left. It's like, oh, I'm not part of that anymore. And you're cheering because they're doing great, but you realize, oh, it's not me anymore. And it took me a little while to adjust to that. And, that's why I'm a big believer in this. You got to just go. And once the transition's ready, you just got to be able to do it.
So let's go to the flip side of that. How did you react to challenges after you retired that you saw them going through that you weren't able to really speak into and provide wisdom around?
Yeah, a great question, son. I'll give you an example. My daughter lived in an apartment complex near the old Showplace Cinema. And we were going to visit her, and across the hall was a former associate of mine at the bank. And it was right at the time that Old National had acquired the bank in Chicago. And I always said I would never go to Chicago. So I was walking up the stairs, and the young woman walked out of her door. Coincidentally, she goes, "What do you think about the bank acquisition in Chicago?" I said, "It's not my problem to think about it anymore." And you've got to coach yourself to that, because You don't want to be second guessing the people that you've turned the keys over to. And, we've all seen it. I went through a period of time when, I first got the job at Old National. Every former employee was calling me up saying, here's what you ought to do. And, you've got to trust the process. And I think that's where people like yourself come in such a strong way, is to help think through succession. It's not just hand the keys over. There's got to be a process to it. There's got to be, bumper pads. There's got to be a roles and responsibilities. And I think great companies are those that can figure that out. And, one of the things we're most proud of at the bank is to be able to have an internal successor, which is very unusual these days.
Yeah. And that's a really big point. And, the research by Forbes, Bridgespan, others shows that when possible, equal playing fields, that internal successors will outperform external candidates. And, in our space, and I have this discussion a lot. So I heard a great guy that I listen to from time to time who does corporate succession planning. Now, keep in mind that, and he does more holistic approach work like we do, a little bit different, but he's working with people who have 1,000 to 10,000 employees. And, he always starts off his focus of, hey, you've got to ask yourself, do all of these key positions have an internal candidate in 10 years? If not, you need to build a pipeline, which I think is great. And I still use that even for, our clients, which can be anywhere from a large organization to very small where they have 2 employees, but still asking them the question, what does it look like to at least be thinking about an internal pathway, whether you have the person or not? And, for you, that is a really unique thing to have a great internal candidate that you're developing and able to cultivate and groom. I would think though, but in addition to that as you started to think about an internal candidate, that did you find, and again, I haven't been through this, only what I've worked in coaching, like how did you respond by your own sense of grieving? So like some would say, okay, well, an internal candidate may actually expedite my grieving process because now I'm seeing the person on a regular basis and I'm thinking about they're going to replace me. Then others would say, well, that would give me a lot of comfort knowing that it's less of, hey, I'm gone on May 10th and someone new sitting in my office. Like, how did you find that experience of having set out an internal pathway?
Yeah, I would say that, for me, I would have much more grieving with an outside candidate because they would have come in and completely changed the world, and Jim did a lot of changes, but I would argue, Jamie, it was more like a proud father you've got to put your ego aside, realize that it's now his. Right. And just, again, I use the word a proud father, a big brother, whatever. But let me go back to your earlier point too, that even in nonprofits or smaller companies, smaller nonprofits, one of the key roles of any board is succession planning. And too many times we only think about it when the person in charge makes that, oh, I'm going to retire or whatever. What my board did phenomenally well is 3 to 5 years before I was ready to go, we started having discussions about who could be the successor, what the skill sets we're looking for. So I would argue even in nonprofits, they ought to, okay, if so-and-so leaves, do we have a backup plan or if something?
Right.
And too many times it becomes crisis management versus succession management.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. I push back on that a lot with individuals and organizations I work with when they will use the word transition management instead of succession, because transition is episodic. Succession is ongoing, dynamic, and it's fluid. And it's about building the culture, to your point.
Yeah. And it's about looking at the people and saying, where are their flat spots?
Right.
If Susie's going to be the successor, can she do development? Can she do people management? Does she have a financial background? If she's got a flat spot, find some way to help that flat spot. So get her a mentor that's a great development person. Get her some understanding of the finances, because my hypothesis, it's always better to have somebody inside, but you want to make sure that they've got all the skill sets, because so many times Susie's a great development person. All of a sudden she gets in a role and she's like, I can't read a balance sheet. It's
right. So. Yeah, no, that's really good. And that, it does apply, right? The Pareto principle on the 80-20, I mean, 20% of my leaders aren't going to always be able to carry 80% of the weight. So I have to think diversity and how am I equipping lots of different people with the skill sets before they get there so they are more holistic. So let's go back to a personal question, and that is on the transition. So you transition out and you've got now your successor, and you see, we talked about the challenges and the wins, but now you see changes. You see things that, that they're changing that you didn't change under your leadership. How did you react to those? Like, how did those changes hit you from a standpoint of, okay, well, now 90 days or 6 months later, they're making this big change, but yet you didn't feel the need to make that change when you were there. Like, how did you make sense of those emotions and even logic behind it?
Yeah, if you do the succession properly, there's going to be change.
Right.
And you yourself have got to be prepared. And again, I'm going to use that analogy. You've got to tear yourself away. So, I announced my retirement in January. Jim was selected in March-ish, April. Almost immediately, I said, Jim, you need to get your team off site and begin to think about what you want this company to look like. So you've got to check your ego a little bit. You've got to say,
that's powerful.
You've got to say, okay. And, he was kind enough. He said, hey, do you want to come to a meeting? I said, the last thing you do is you want me in the room. So everybody's going to look around and say, oh, and part of it, Jamie, is you have to know when it's your time. Yeah, you've got personal burnout, but, I knew that in my case, that the company needed to go through another 6, transformative time because the world changes. And I didn't have the energy or maybe even the gray matter to do that. That's when you've got to know. So, too many times people are afraid to go and, they hang around too long and guess what? The world passes them by. So, but, it's hard. You got to check that ego a lot because, again, you were the guy and all of a sudden, I can remember soon after I announced it, I'd go downstairs and everybody's talking to Jim. I'm like, well, I'm still here, but, it is what it is. And you just got to make sure.
Well, so you just hit on something, though, pretty profound. And that is that while you were still active in leadership, you had him and that team go off and plan and sense make about what they were going to do when you're not there and their next steps. One, to your point, that takes a whole lot of humility and self-discipline as well. I mean, humility to be able to say, yeah, I want you to do this while I'm here, but people can say that and not really know how to get out of the way. But then the self-discipline for you to set some demarcations and not interfere. And then knowing that they're coming back, having a strategy of, okay, when you're not in place, here are our next moves. That one, that's pretty profound. Two, the humility to deal with the aftermath emotions of that process is huge, I think, because it's not just that's happening when you're not there. It's happening while you're there. And that they're actively creating their strategy for the post Bob Jones era. That's amazing to me. What a great recommendation if a leader can do it. But that's really amazing.
But you got to do it. I mean, as I think I've said to you before, when you're in charge, whether it's you running the nonprofit or the for-profit, and you're the CEO or the president, you only rent that seat. It's not, you don't own the seat. So when your lease is up, you've got to make sure the next tenant or lessor is ready to do their job. And, I think, again, I'm going to go back to, I knew that I had to find something else to do, more purpose. And, I was, just ready to make the move. But I had great confidence that Jim was going to do a great job.
Did you and your wife ever engage together as you were processing emotions and the transition in your identity going into retirement? Yeah. How was that?
It was great. When Lisa had worked, but, she was very quick. She goes, you're not going to the grocery store with me. I'm not making you breakfast. Don't ask me what you want to do every day. And she's been very supportive about, she jokes that, I go out and have coffee about 4 days a week. And I'm either meeting with a nonprofit trying to help
Right.
them in any way or just, try to have a social life. But she was really good about not saying, you're retired, now you're all mine. She knew that I had to have, you just can't not, when you've been in charge or you've made an impact, you want to continue to do the things that you've done. And she's been very, very supportive. But you have to, and what I also should mention, Jamie, is we actually took a class together on retirement. We went down it's through OSHA Institute. It was down at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. It's a 3-day class, had nothing to do with the financial side of retirement and all to do with the emotional side of retirement for couples. And it was, we actually, at one stage you played like Jeopardy. You had to answer questions and compare answers. And fortunately, we were 9 out of 10 on the same page, which was shocking, but it was a really good class. And it's something we might want to think about as you're going through this process. Okay, you're getting ready to retire. Let's do a little coaching for the couples.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very fascinating to me. Yeah, let's continue to explore that. There's such a need for that.
Yeah, because, so many times you think of retirement, it's always the financial side. With all due respect, as a banker, that's the easy part. You can run your models and if you've got the wherewithal to retire financially, but so much of it's emotional, and that emotion's two sides. You can see, I've known couples that, the guy retired or, the girl retired, they had nothing to do and they sit around and mope all day. And, it's hard in a marriage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you're hitting on really critical points we come up against a lot in just our coaching process of transition. Yeah, I mean, just listening to you, it's, goes back to what we said earlier, know the emotions are going to come, know that you've got to grieve, let grieving happen while you're there. But you're just flashing the light of, you've got to gut check your humility before you go into this process if you're going to do it well. And then out of humility, what I hear you saying is push the team and the organization forward beyond you. So that when you're transitioning, it's not just that and I use transition now as the episodic word, okay, you made the transition on May 10th, but that no, you actually gave the organization a really big push so that hopefully, it kind of reminds me of if I'm, pushing a shopping cart and, I shove it, it's going to create a lot more momentum once I let it go and it just continues on as opposed to quicker than what I can walk with it. And you really are identifying that process you did with your organization. You gave them a big push, knowing that it was going to leave you behind, but in a place of discipline and humility, you've helped them become stronger by doing that push.
Yeah, and they're in a much better place right now.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And I just will say as a capstone for listeners, you and I have worked together professionally for a lot of years, personally for a lot of years. I get to see your fingerprint post-retirement. And, you are one of those unique leaders who I can honestly say, watching kind of on the sidelines and the stuff that we've done together, that your influence and I mean that in a positive way, not in a pompous way, but your positive move the needle influence. I don't see a demarcation between Bob Jones as former CEO of a large bank to Bob Jones as now civic leader. In a lot of ways, I've seen that influence and momentum grow significantly as you've transitioned. And, you really have done it well. And I think that's evidenced in the communities that you're in and just the continued positive impact that you're having around your purpose, Bob. And I get to work with a lot of leaders, and I can't say that about a lot. And just so you know, I really value having that opportunity to be a part of this with you.
It's mutual respect, my friend. And thank you for all you do to help the nonprofits in the world.
Absolutely. So appreciate you. And thanks again.
Thanks for listening to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. If you have comments or ideas for future episodes, please reach out using the contact page on our website, jdlevyassociates.com.